The night before, I couldn't sleep. The small cot in the camp barracks felt impossibly hard, yet I tossed and turned, haunted by the low hum of engines in the distance and the endless whispers of men around me, each consumed by his own fears. It was June 5, 1944, and by tomorrow morning, the Atlantic would not be the same. I tried to focus on the letters I'd written home, the ones I would probably never send, but the words felt hollow, meaningless against the storm of what awaited us. We were briefed repeatedly, though the officers spoke in clipped tones that did little to soothe the gnawing anxiety in my gut. "H hour is 6:30, they said over and over, as if repeating it enough times could make it any less terrifying. I could hear men muttering, some praying, others laughing nervously. Laughter was a thin veneer over terror. I told myself it was okay to be afraid. Fear was normal. But I hated that my hands shook when I tried to tighten my straps. The landing craft was cold, wet, and smelled of diesel and fear. I huddled with the men around me, each of us clutching our rifles, helmets pressed tight against our ears. The water outside was black, infinite, and indifferent. I thought about my father, a man I hadn't seen in years, and my little sister, who probably thought I was safe somewhere far away. I wondered if they would ever know what I saw. We moved toward the beaches under cover of darkness, engines droning, waves slapping the sides of the craft. The sky was low, the clouds a heavy gray curtain. Every splash outside felt like a warning. I closed my eyes for a brief second, imagining the house we'd built on the lake, the summer I caught my first fish. And then the horn blared, signaling we were almost there, and reality crashed down again. When the ramp dropped, chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air like angry wasps. Men screamed, some fell immediately, some struggled to move forward, and the sand, God, the sand was sticky and cold and red with more than just water. I remember thinking in that first instant, I will not stop. I will not. Every step was a struggle, every breath heavy, but moving meant life. Standing still meant death. I saw Sergeant Miller beside me take a round to the shoulder. His eyes went wide, a silent scream frozen on his face. I grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shallow waves, trying to keep us both moving. My boots sank into the sand with every step, dragging me down, but the shouts of officers and the machine gun fire pushed me forward. Men I had trained with, laughed with, argued with were now shadows in the smoke and spray, disappearing in seconds. I had to remind myself, focus, survive, push forward. A shell exploded nearby, throwing sand, debris, and men into the air. I hit the ground, my helmet filling with water and grit. My ears rang. I couldn't tell if it was the water or the noise. When I opened my eyes, the sergeant was gone. I couldn't stop to search. I had to move. I crawled, scrambled, and finally staggered upright, rifle ready, heart hammering in my chest. We were onto the beach, yet it felt like an eternity of fire before reaching the cover of the first dune. Behind me, the craft sank into the surf. I realized some of the men hadn't made it off. Their faces, frozen in horror, haunted me. I didn't allow myself to think about them for long. If I lingered, I would fall apart. Ahead, the cliffs loomed, barbed wire and mines hidden in the sand. Our objective was clear, but the path was obscured by chaos, smoke, and death. I kept moving, dragging a wounded soldier along, ignoring the screams, ignoring the fear that threatened to paralyze me. In those first hours, the world narrowed down to a single purpose: survive, advance, keep moving. Every man was a study in human endurance. Some cried openly. Some fought like machines, and some simply lay in the sand, no longer capable of either. I remember thinking it was unfair. Why were some spared and others not? There was no answer, only the relentless grind of war pressing down. By midday, we reached the makeshift cover near the top of the first cliff. We were battered, bloody, and exhausted, yet somehow alive. The air smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and the salt of the sea. The moans of the wounded, the shouts of officers, the distant roar of artillery created a symphony of hell. I sat behind a broken wall of concrete, soaked, shaking, and yet I scribbled notes in my small journal I had managed to keep in my breast pocket. Perhaps someone would read them one day. Perhaps they would understand that we pressed forward in waves, men falling and rising like the tide. I encountered a young private from the next company who had lost his helmet and was bleeding from the scalp. His eyes were wide, unfocused. I grabbed his hand, tried to lead him forward. His grip was weak, slipping from mine. I whispered, "You'll make it. Keep moving." But I wasn't sure either of us would. Hours passed like days. Every dune, every ridge, every bunker was a battle. I felt the weight of responsibility for those around me, for every life that depended on my decision to advance or hold back. I prayed silently, cursing God and the fate that had placed me here, asking only for the strength to endure another moment. By evening, we had secured a small section of the beachhead. The sky burned orange as the sun set over the blood-soaked sand. I found a moment to look around, and the scale of the destruction hit me. Craters, bodies, weapons, smoke. It was a world transformed by violence in a single day. And yet, somehow the operation continued. Reinforcements arrived, bringing fresh waves of men and supplies. Hope, fragile and fleeting, flickered in the chaos that I wrote in my journal. If I survive, remember this. Remember the courage, the terror, the faces, the fear, the love for life that never falters even in the face of death. Remember the men beside me who will never come home, and carry them in your heart, always. The night came again, but this time it was different. We had survived the first day, the first impossible hours. Exhausted, I lay against a crater's edge, listening to the distant echo of gunfire, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. And I knew, deep in my bones, that survival was only the beginning. The night was thick with smoke and the scent of spent gunpowder. Exhaustion weighed on me like an anchor, yet sleep was impossible. Every snap of a branch, every distant scream, jolted me awake. Around me, men were dozing in fits and starts, helmets pressed over their faces, rifles clutched tight even in unconsciousness. I listened to their shallow breathing and tried to calm my own racing heart. Tomorrow we would push inland. Tomorrow the real fight would begin. I checked my rifle again, methodically, almost mechanically. Bullets, magazine, safety, each part a talisman against the chaos outside. My hands were raw from gripping it all day, from dragging men through sand and blood, but the weapon felt like an extension of myself. If it failed, I would not. We moved before dawn, creeping over the shattered terrain of Normandy. The first light revealed a landscape that resembled nothing so much as a nightmare painted in gray and red. Craters dotted the sand, trenches carved by shells, and everywhere the evidence of human suffering lay in stark relief. I saw soldiers frozen mid-step, their faces locked in expressions of fear or pain. I averted my eyes, forcing myself forward. Survival demanded focus. Our objective was a series of bunkers that controlled the road inland. Intelligence had told us they were lightly defended, but the map had been drawn before reality, and reality was always heavier than paper. We crawled under machine gun fire, low in the mud, the sound of bullets slicing the air like angry bees. One of the men next to me fell, clutching his leg. I grabbed his arm, dragging him along, feeling the warm trickle of blood on my sleeve. There was no time to mourn. The tide of war pressed us relentlessly forward. By mid-morning, we had taken the first bunker, a concrete block scarred by artillery. I remember the smell of fear mixed with decay as we cleared it. Inside, the enemy lay where they fell, rifles discarded, eyes wide in disbelief. The stench of gunpowder and blood was almost suffocating. I thought of home again, of the small comforts I would never see if I stayed here much longer. The thought both steadied and haunted me. The next hours were a blur of movement, fire, and shouted orders. Men fell around me with terrifying frequency, and I learned to move without looking, to trust instinct over reason. A shell landed too close. Sand and smoke enveloped me, and I hit the ground. When I looked up, Corporal Hayes, a man I had shared rations with only days ago, was gone. My stomach knotted with guilt, though I knew rationally there was nothing I could have done. Every life taken was a reminder of the stakes, of the thin thread on which we balanced between life and death. By afternoon, we reached a small farmhouse that overlooked the valley. It was battered, walls riddled with bullets, roof partially collapsed. Still, it offered a vantage point. From there, I could see other units struggling through hedgerows, smoke curling like spectral fingers from every direction. The landscape itself seemed alive with menace, each tree a sniper's perch, each stone a potential death trap. I crouched behind a wall, taking stock of our dwindling numbers, the faces of men etched with exhaustion, dirt, and resolve. I pulled out my journal for a few moments. My hand shook as I wrote. If anyone ever reads this, know that we fought not for glory, but for survival, for the men beside us, for the faint hope that the world might remember we existed and that we mattered. A mortar round exploded in the distance, shaking the ground. My words blurred, and I tore the page from the book, stuffing it into my breast pocket. There would be no letters today, only memories inked in haste. Night fell again, but the air was alive with tension rather than silence. Every shadow moved, every rustle suggested danger. Fires burned in the distance, sending flares of orange into the dark sky. I shared a quiet moment with a medic, a young man barely older than my brother. He handed me water and a bandage, his eyes betraying the same fear I tried to suppress. "We'll make it through," he whispered, though neither of us truly believed it. Yet somehow hope persisted in tiny, stubborn sparks that we fortified our position as best we could, creating makeshift barriers from rubble, sandbags, and the bodies of what had been once ordinary things. Chairs, crates, remnants of farm life. The night was punctuated by sporadic gunfire and the occasional cry from the wounded. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by the constant vigilance that survival demanded. I listened to the distant thrum of artillery, feeling it resonate through my bones, a reminder that the war beyond our little perimeter never ceased. At some point, I drifted into a fitful half-sleep, only to wake to the sound of screaming. A patrol had encountered a hidden machine gun nest, and men were down before anyone could react. I ran toward the sound, firing my rifle blindly, heart hammering. The fear was familiar now, but it was tempered by a grim determination. Every action mattered. Every step forward was a victory against the relentless tide of violence. By dawn, exhaustion had carved deep lines into my face, but we had survived another night. The beachhead was expanding, reinforcements arriving steadily, the tide of war pushing inland. And yet, the cost was incalculable. Men I had laughed with, shared stories and rations with, were gone. Their absence was a heavy weight, a constant reminder that life and death were balanced on the edge of a knife. I wrote in my journal once more, pausing as I stared at the horizon. Tomorrow, we fight again, for every man who cannot, for every hope that refuses to die. We move forward, though the world is broken around us. And if I survive, I will remember. Always. The days that followed were an endless procession of heat, mud, and fear. Each step inland brought new dangers, new losses, and new memories I could never unsee. The hedgerows of Normandy became a maze, a trap where every turn could hide death. I moved cautiously, rifle raised, eyes scanning every tree line, every crumbling wall. The land itself seemed alive, conspiring against us. I saw men fall beside me. Friends, strangers, all alike in the sudden finality of a bullet or a shell. Sergeant Miller, who I had thought lost in the first wave but had survived by some miracle, pressed forward with grim determination. His courage was a beacon in the darkness, yet even he could not shield us from the relentless toll. I carried what I could of the wounded, but the numbers overwhelmed us. The cries of the dying were constant companions, etched into my memory. By the second day, exhaustion had become a living entity. My boots were caked in mud, my uniform torn and blood-stained. Each breath felt heavy, as if the weight of survival itself pressed down on my chest. Sleep was impossible, but brief moments of rest came in small craters, behind broken walls, wherever I could find cover. Even then, the sounds of war, distant artillery, the occasional rifle shot, the groans of the injured, kept me alert. We advanced through a small village that had been reduced to rubble. Houses were shells, their interiors gutted, walls pocked with bullets. Civilians had fled or perished, leaving behind the remnants of ordinary life. I paused briefly in what had once been a bakery, the smell of bread faint in the air, now overwhelmed by smoke and blood. For a moment, I let myself remember home, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the warmth of summer evenings. And then a scream jolted me back to reality. There was no time for nostalgia. The fighting became more brutal as the enemy realized the beachhead could not be contained. Machine gun nests, sniper fire, and sudden artillery barrages tested every ounce of our resolve. I learned to trust instinct over reason. Sometimes moving without thinking was the only way to survive. A man beside me froze under fire. I grabbed his arm, dragging him into cover. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending, and I realized that terror could paralyze as effectively as a bullet. That I began to notice how war changes a man, almost imperceptibly. Humor became dark and biting. Conversations were clipped. Trust was a precious commodity. Yet in this chaos, moments of humanity persisted. A medic, exhausted and filthy, shared a small packet of chocolate with me, a fleeting reminder of life beyond the battlefield. A soldier whispered a prayer for his brother, who had fallen the day before. These fragments of normalcy became treasures, reminders of who we were beneath the grime and fear. By the third day, our advance slowed. Supply lines were stretched thin, ammunition dwindled, and food was rationed to near starvation levels. Yet the fighting continued, relentless. Every hedge, every ruined barn, every shallow ditch could conceal death. I found myself measuring distance in terms of cover, in moments of opportunity between the bursts of enemy fire. Life had become tactical, measured in inches and seconds. One afternoon, I stumbled upon a German soldier, a young man no older than I, lying wounded and begging for water. I hesitated, rifle raised, heart pounding. There was no room for mercy in the chaos, yet something in his eyes struck me, the same fear I saw in every man on my side. I lowered my weapon and handed him what little water I had. The war made monsters of all of us, yet small acts of humanity persisted, like fragile sparks in a storm. As we pressed on, the scale of the battle became overwhelming. Bodies littered the fields, and the wounded cries never ceased. I began marking positions, noting the fallen, scribbling in my journal when I could find a moment. I wrote not to chronicle victory, but to remember the men who had trusted me with their lives. who had laughed, fought, and bled beside me to be why nightfall. We took a small ridge overlooking a valley. From there, the view of the advancing forces was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. Smoke curled in waves, artillery shells exploded in bursts of fire, and the distant cries of men carried across the fields. We had survived another day, yet the cost was incalculable. The ridge became our refuge for the night, a fragile pocket of safety amid the chaos. I found a brief moment to write, "Every day is a gift, though few would call it such. The men beside me, the ones who fall and rise again, are courage made flesh. If I survive, I will carry their memory. Every step forward is for them. Every heartbeat is for them. And in the end, if there is an end, I hope the world remembers that courage, not just the violence." As I lay against a shattered wall, listening to the distant roar of artillery, I realized that survival had become a habit, a relentless drive to endure. Yet beneath that drive, beneath the adrenaline and fear, there was a quiet sorrow, a mourning for the innocents lost, for the lives taken, for the world that would never be the same. The fourth day dawned cold and gray, the sky an unrelenting slate that mirrored the weight in my chest. We had moved inland, each village and farm a battlefield, each hedgerow a deadly trap. The bodies of men we had once called friends were everywhere, silent reminders of mortality. I had begun to recognize the faces in my dreams. Miller, Hayes, and the private whose helmet had been shattered the first morning. They haunted me, but I could not stop. Survival demanded forward motion. By mid-morning, our unit encountered stiff resistance near a heavily fortified farmhouse. German positions were entrenched, machine guns sweeping every approach. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives. Men fell as quickly as they advanced, and I realized that courage alone was not enough. Strategy, luck, and the merciless randomness of war dictated survival. I took cover behind a low wall, my rifle shaking in my hands. Around me, men shouted, cried, and fired indiscriminately. The chaos was a living entity, and I felt both part of it and apart from it, a spectator and a participant simultaneously. A shell hit the roof of the farmhouse, sending shards of wood and plaster into the air. A soldier next to me disappeared under the debris. I pressed my body to the ground, closing my eyes, wishing for a moment that the world could stop spinning. Minutes, hours, or perhaps seconds passed in an unmeasurable blur. I crawled forward, dragging a wounded comrade along. His breathing was shallow, his hand cold against mine. "Keep going," I whispered, though my voice felt weak even to me. The ground was soaked with mud and blood, and the sun's weak rays reflected off pools of water and scattered shells. Each step was a battle against gravity, fatigue, and terror. By late afternoon, we had gained a precarious foothold, but the cost was immense. The survivors were fewer than half of our original unit. I looked around, seeing faces hardened by exhaustion, eyes haunted by what they had seen. I realized that every man carried invisible scars as deep as the visible ones on their bodies. And I, too, felt the weight of experience pressing down like a physical force. Nightfall brought no relief. We dug shallow foxholes wherever we could, using what little cover remained. The cries of the wounded echoed across the fields, punctuated by sporadic gunfire. Sleep was fleeting, broken by nightmares that mirrored reality too closely. I dreamt of the first landing, of Miller's scream, of bodies tossed in the surf, and woke drenched in sweat, gasping, convinced for a moment that I was still in the water, still fighting for every inch.